There is a street in an old part of the city where the houses lean a little into each other, like neighbors who have been gossiping for 50 years and never got tired of it. On that street, in a house with a blue gate and a mango tree that never gave good fruit, lived a family named Yusuf. And 2 streets away, in a bigger house with a quieter garden, lived a man named Harun Malik, who had just decided, at the age of 51, that it was time to get married again. He did not decide this the way most people decide such things. There was no long night of thinking, no conversation with his own heart. He decided it the way he decided most things in his life, over breakfast, with a cup of tea going cold beside him, while he read the newspaper and made a mental list. His wife had died 2 years earlier. Her name had been Farida, and for 26 years she had run his house, raised his children, laughed at things he didn't find funny, and quietly put up with a husband who loved her in a way he never once said out loud. When she died, people expected him to fall apart. He didn't. He went back to work 3 days after the funeral. His sister scolded him for it. His son shook his head and said nothing. Harun told everyone the same thing. Work keeps the mind from wandering into rooms it shouldn't enter. For 2 years that worked. Or at least, it looked like it worked. Then one evening, his sister sat across from him at dinner and said, "You are not getting any younger, Harun. This house is too quiet. You need a wife." He didn't argue. He simply nodded. The way he nodded at business proposals he had already half decided to accept. "Find someone suitable," he said. "I don't have particular requirements. Any decent woman, of a good family, reasonable age. That's all." His sister blinked at him. She had expected resistance, or at least a long conversation about the memory of Farida, about loyalty, about grief. Instead, she got a man ordering a wife the way he might order tiles for a bathroom. Durable, reasonably priced, no complaints. "You don't want to meet a few families first? Take your time?" "I don't need romance," Harun said, folding his newspaper. "I need a companion for the rest of my life. One woman is much like another, as long as she is kind and doesn't waste money." His sister opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She had known her brother for 51 years. Arguing with him about feelings was like arguing with a wall about the weather. The wall simply did not care. And so the search began, practical, efficient, and almost cold, the way Harun liked everything in his life to be. The matchmaker his family used was a woman named Rukhsana Baji, who had been arranging marriages in that part of the city for almost 30 years and knew every family's secrets better than the families knew them themselves. When Harun's sister called her, Rukhsana Baji did not need to think for long. "The Yusuf family," she said. 3 daughters, all unmarried, all of good character. The father is a retired school teacher, very respected. The mother keeps a clean house and raised good girls. Any one of them would suit your brother." "Any one?" Harun's sister repeated. "Any one," Rukhsana Baji said confidently. "They are all good girls." When this was reported back to Harun, he simply shrugged. "Then let's meet them and decide. I don't need to complicate this." He said it the way another man might say, "Let's pick a restaurant. It doesn't matter which one. They all serve food." He had no idea, of course, that one of those 3 daughters was about to walk into his life and rearrange every assumption he had ever made about what marriage was supposed to feel like. The Yusuf household, meanwhile, was having a very different kind of conversation. Ghulam Yusuf, the father, was a retired school teacher who still woke up at 5 every morning out of habit, even though there were no classes to teach anymore. He read 3 newspapers a day and had opinions about all of them. His wife Nesreen ran the house with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had raised 3 daughters more or less alone, while her husband was busy shaping the minds of other people's children. Their eldest daughter, Rania, was 29, tall, composed, and beautiful in the effortless way that made people assume she never had a bad day, even though she often did. She worked at a private bank and had, for the past year, been quietly seeing a man from her office, a fact she had not yet told her parents, because she was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept refusing to arrive. The middle daughter, Dina was 27 and had spent most of her adult life trying to be exactly what everyone expected of her. She was a good cook, a good listener, and endlessly anxious about being good enough. She wanted to get married, not out of desperation, but because she genuinely believed a husband and a home of her own would finally quiet the constant hum of worry in her chest. She had rehearsed, more than once, how she would answer questions in a Rishta meeting, the way some people rehearse job interviews. The youngest, Mariam, was 26, taught 4th grade at a government school 2 streets away, and had absolutely no interest in being rehearsed for anything. Mariam was the kind of person who forgot appointments not because she was careless, but because her mind was usually somewhere more interesting, grading a stack of homework, arguing with herself about a book she was reading, or trying to figure out why the neighborhood's stray cats always gathered outside her classroom window at exactly 10 in the morning. She had a habit of saying exactly what she thought, at exactly the wrong moment, and somehow never quite learning to stop. When Nasreen called the 3 daughters into the sitting room to tell them about Rukhsana Baji's visit, Rania went pale and thought immediately of the man from her office. Dina's heart began to beat a little faster, half hope and half fear. Mariam simply asked, "Is there tea? I'm starving." "Mariam," her mother said, exasperated, "this is serious. A man wants to marry one of you. We don't even know which one yet. He says he has no preference." "That's a strange way to look for a wife," Mariam said, reaching for a biscuit. "Like he's shopping for a fan. Any brand will do, as long as it spins." "Mariam, I'm just saying," she took a bite. "Anyway, it won't be me. I'm sure he'll like Rania or Dina. I'm not exactly Rishta material." She said this without bitterness, the way someone states a fact about the weather. She was not being falsely modest. Mariam genuinely believed this. She was not the eldest, which usually mattered in these families. She was not soft-spoken like Dina, and she didn't have Rania's effortless polish. She spoke her mind too easily, laughed too loudly at her own jokes, and had once told a Rishta family, years earlier, before they'd even ordered tea, that she thought arranged introductions were slightly ridiculous, which had ended that particular prospect within the hour. Her mother had never quite forgiven her for that. "Just behave yourself this time," Nasreen said now, pointing a finger at her youngest daughter. "If they come to see you, don't say anything strange." "I make no promises," Mariam said cheerfully, and went back to her tea. The visits were arranged for 3 separate Sundays, because Rukhsana Baji believed strongly that meeting all 3 daughters at once was undignified, like laying out merchandise on a table. Better, she said, to let each girl have her own proper introduction. Harun agreed to this arrangement without much thought. To him, one Sunday was as good as another. The first Sunday belonged to Rania. She wore a soft blue outfit that her mother had ironed twice, sat with her hands folded in her lap, and answered every question with the composed grace of someone who had spent years learning how to seem at ease even when she wasn't. Harun asked about her work. She answered clearly. He asked about her interests. She mentioned reading and long walks, though in truth she hadn't taken a long walk in over a year. Throughout the conversation, her phone buzzed twice in her pocket, and both times she resisted the urge to check it, though her eyes flickered toward her bag for just a second each time. Harun did not notice. He was not a man who noticed where eyes went. He noticed punctuality, manners, and whether tea was served hot. Rania passed on all 3 counts. He found her perfectly acceptable and utterly unremarkable, though he would not have used that second word out loud, even to himself. After the guests left, Rania went straight to her room and called the man from her office, her voice trembling as she whispered into the phone that she didn't know what to do, that her family was arranging her marriage to a stranger while she was already, quietly, secretly, in love with someone else. He told her to be brave and tell her parents the truth. She told him it wasn't that simple. It rarely is. The second Sunday belonged to Dina. Dina had prepared for this meeting the way some students prepare for final exams. She had thought through likely questions and rehearsed calm, agreeable answers. She wore a soft green outfit, kept her eyes lowered in the appropriately modest way, And when Harun asked what she liked to do in the evenings, she said, "Whatever makes my husband happy, of course," with a small, practiced smile. It was, in its own way, a perfectly correct answer. It was also, somewhere deep in a part of Harun that he rarely visited, faintly, quietly boring. He didn't examine the feeling, he simply filed it away, the way a man files away a piece of paper he doesn't yet know he'll need later, and nodded politely, and asked for more tea. Dina, watching him nod, felt a small flicker of hope. She had been told her whole life that being agreeable was the surest path to being loved, and here was a man nodding at her agreeableness. Surely that meant something. The third Sunday belonged to Miriam, and it did not go according to anyone's plan. That morning, Nasreen had reminded Miriam 3 separate times about the visit, once at breakfast, once while Miriam was getting dressed for what she thought was a normal Sunday, and once again an hour before the guests were due to arrive. Each time, Miriam had nodded and said, I know," and each time, within minutes, the information had slipped straight out of her head like water through a cracked cup. She was, at the exact moment Harun Malik's car pulled up outside the blue gate, standing in the kitchen with flour on her sleeve, arguing with her mother about rice. "It's not overcooked," Miriam was saying, gesturing with a wooden spoon. "It's perfectly fine. You always think everything is overcooked. I have been cooking rice for 30 years, Miriam. I think I would know. That's exactly the problem. 30 years of the same rice, and you still think it's wrong. Maybe it's not the rice, maybe it's you." Miriam. It was at that moment that the doorbell rang, and a full 3 seconds later, that the information finally arrived in Miriam's mind. Today, Sunday. The man. Oh no. She looked down at herself. An old camise, flour dusted across one shoulder, a dish towel still gripped in one hand from where she'd been drying a pot, and understood, with total clarity, that there was no possible way to fix this in the next 30 seconds. Her mother's eyes went wide with horror. Go change, quickly, I'll stall them." But it was too late. Rukhsana Baji's cheerful voice was already floating in from the hallway, and behind her came the sound of the front door, and footsteps, and before Maryam could escape through the back of the kitchen, she found herself standing in the doorway of the sitting room, dish towel in hand, flour on her sleeve, hair escaping its clip in 3 different directions, face to face with a tall, solidly built man in a gray shirt who was already seated on the good sofa, looking, for the first time in this entire process, mildly curious about something. There was a beat of silence. Nasreen, behind Maryam, made a small strangled noise. Maryam, who had absolutely no plan for this moment, did the only thing that occurred to her. She looked past the stranger, directly at her mother, and said, "See, I told you, the rice is fine. I don't care what anyone says." Then she remembered there were guests in the room, and felt her face go warm, and said, "Sorry. Hello, I forgot you were coming today." Rukhsana Baji looked faintly scandalized. Nasreen looked like she wanted the floor to open beneath her. Harun Malik, seated on the good sofa with a cup of tea he hadn't yet touched, looked at the young woman standing in the doorway, with flour on her sleeve and an argument about rice still half alive in her voice, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for. He had met 2 composed, careful, well-prepared young women over the previous 2 Sundays. Both had said all the right things. Both had left him feeling exactly as unmoved as he'd expected to feel, because he hadn't expected to feel anything at all. This one had walked in mid-argument, wearing flour like a badge, and told her mother off in front of a stranger without a shred of self-consciousness. He found, to his own surprise, that he was smiling. "Please," he said, gesturing at the empty seat across from him. "Sit. Finish telling me about the rice." Miriam blinked. Nobody had ever asked to hear more about the rice. She sat down, still holding the dish towel because she genuinely didn't know what else to do with it, and for the next 40 minutes, something unusual happened. She forgot, almost entirely, that this was supposed to be a formal meeting. She talked to Harun the way she talked to anyone, directly, with opinions, occasionally too honestly. She told him she thought the whole Rishta process was a bit like a job interview, where nobody was allowed to ask the real questions. She told him she loved teaching but hated the new curriculum. She told him, when he asked what she thought of him so far, that she didn't really know him yet, so how could she think anything? It was, by every traditional standard, an unsuccessful meeting. She hadn't been modest. She hadn't been careful. She had, at one point, laughed loudly enough that her father looked in from the next room to check nothing was wrong. And yet, when Rukhsana Baji finally rose to leave, gathering her things with the slightly flustered energy of a woman whose careful arrangements had gone sideways, Harun Malik stood at the door and said quietly, to no one in particular, "I've decided." The decision, when it reached the Yusuf household 2 days later through Rukhsana Baji's phone call, landed like a stone dropped into still water. "He wants Maryam," Rukhsana Baji said, and even through the phone, her voice carried a note of disbelief, as though she herself couldn't quite explain it. "Not Rania, not Dina, Maryam." Nasreen sat down slowly on the nearest chair. Ghulam Yusuf, listening from across the room, raised his eyebrows but said nothing, which for him was a significant reaction. Rania, upstairs, heard the news from her mother's raised voice traveling up through the floorboards and felt a wave of relief so strong her knees went a little weak. She sat on her bed and, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to imagine actually telling her parents about the man from the office. Dina heard the news standing in the kitchen doorway, and something in her chest simply deflated. She didn't cry in front of anyone. She went to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and let herself feel, all at once, both the disappointment and, underneath it, something she didn't want to admit, a small, guilty relief. She hadn't wanted a man who nodded politely at agreeable answers. She had wanted to be chosen. Those were, she was beginning to realize, two very different things. And Maryam, when she was told, put down the book she was reading, looked at her mother, and said, "No, no," Nasreen repeated, as though the word itself was foreign. "No," Maryam said again, calmly. "I'm not marrying him. Maryam, he chose you. Out of your sisters, he chose you. Do you understand what an honor?" "I understand exactly what happened," Maryam said, and there was something harder in her voice now, something that made her mother pause. "He sat there and looked at me the way you look at a chair in a shop, deciding whether it fits the room. I'm not interested in being chosen like that." "You're being ungrateful." "I'm being honest," Maryam said, which is apparently a rare thing to be in that sitting room. She went back to her book, or tried to, though the words no longer made any sense on the page. Her mother argued for another 20 minutes, moving through every tool in her arsenal: duty, family honor, the fact that a good man was hard to find, the fact that Maryam wasn't getting any younger either. Maryam listened to all of it and did not change her answer once. Her father said nothing throughout the argument, which everyone in the house understood to be its own kind of statement. Ghulam Yusuf had never been a man who forced his daughters into anything. When Nasreen finally turned to him, exasperated, and demanded he say something, he simply said, "She said no. That's her answer to give." Nasreen threw up her hands and left the room. 2 days later, the refusal was delivered back to Harun Malik through Rukhsana Baji, in the careful, softened language matchmakers use for such things. The family is honored, but the daughter feels the match may not be suitable at this time. Harun received this news the way he received most difficult things, quietly, without visible reaction. He thanked Rukhsana Baji for her efforts and hung up the phone. Then he sat at his desk for a long time, doing nothing at all, which was, for a man who filled every hour of his day with tasks, a very unusual thing. He had been refused before, in small ways, a business deal that fell through, a golf partner who canceled, but he could not remember the last time he had been refused by a person, directly, over something that mattered to him. And it did matter to him, which was the part that confused him most. He had gone into this search for a wife the way he went into buying furniture, and somewhere in one Sunday afternoon, in one sitting room, A young woman with flower on her sleeve had made him feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 2 long years. Genuine, unguarded curiosity about another human being. And she had said no. He told himself that evening to let it go. There were other families, other daughters, other Sundays. Roxana Baji had already mentioned 2 more prospects, both perfectly suitable, both undoubtedly agreeable. He found, over the following week, that he could not stop thinking about the rice. It was his sister who finally asked him, over dinner 10 days later, why he'd barely touched his food and kept staring at nothing. "You've been strange since that girl said no," she said. "The teacher, what was her name?" "Mariam," Harun said, and something in the way he said it, too quickly, too easily, made his sister set down her fork. "You're thinking about her." "I'm not thinking about anything, Harun. I have known you 51 years. You are thinking about her." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. 2 days later, he called Roxana Baji himself, something he had never done before. Normally these calls went through his sister. "I want to speak with her," he said. "Not through the formal channel, not with marriage on the table. Just speak with her, if her family allows it." Roxana Baji, who had arranged hundreds of marriages over 3 decades and had never once received this particular request, was quiet for a moment. "That's unusual, Mr. Malik." "I know. May I ask why?" Harun thought about this for longer than the question probably deserved. Finally, he said, "Because in one afternoon, she told me more true things than anyone has told me in 2 years. I'd like to understand what that means before I let it go." It took some convincing on Nasreen's part, some reluctant permission from Ghulam Yusuf, and a fair amount of confusion from Mariam herself. But eventually the message reached her. The man wanted to talk. Not propose, not negotiate, just talk. "That's strange," Mariam said to her mother. "It is. I'm not agreeing to marry him just because we talk. Nobody said you have to." Mariam considered this for a long moment, sitting on the edge of her bed with her knees pulled up, the same way she used to sit as a child when she was deciding whether to eat her vegetables. Finally she said, "Fine, one conversation, but I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not, just so it goes well." "I would be very surprised," her mother said dryly, "if you managed to pretend to be anyone but yourself for longer than 5 minutes." They met at a quiet cafe 2 weeks later, chosen because it was neutral ground, respectable, and had good tea. Mariam arrived first, sat by the window, and spent the 10 minutes before Harun showed up rehearsing, in her head, all the reasons she was going to politely and firmly end this entire arrangement. Then he arrived, sat down across from her, and instead of talking about marriage, he asked her what she was reading. It threw her off balance completely. She had prepared arguments about compatibility and independence and not wanting to be someone's practical decision. She had not prepared for a man to simply ask about her book. "It's about a family in a small village," she said, cautiously. "It's not very good, actually. I keep reading it anyway because I want to know how it ends, even though I already know I'll be disappointed." "That sounds like most things," Harun said, and something about the dry, quiet way he said it made Mariam laugh before she could stop herself. The conversation that followed lasted almost 2 hours, though neither of them noticed the time passing. Mariam found herself telling him about her students, about a boy in her class who refused to write in anything but blue ink, insisting black ink made his thoughts feel unfinished, and how she'd let him, because some battles weren't worth fighting. She told him about the stray cats outside her classroom window, and her theory that they gathered at exactly 10 because that was when the school canteen threw out its scraps, and how she'd never actually confirmed this theory because some mysteries were better left unsolved. Harun listened in a way she wasn't used to being listened to, not waiting for his turn to speak, not nodding along politely while thinking of something else, but actually leaning forward, actually asking questions that showed he'd been paying attention. He asked what happened to the boy with the blue ink. She told him the boy's handwriting had gotten better once he stopped fighting the rule about ink color entirely, once someone had simply let him be who he was without making it a whole battle. Haroon went quiet after that, in a way that made Miriam wonder if she'd said something that meant more to him than she'd intended. She, in turn, found herself asking about his work, his years in Dubai, why he'd come back. He answered honestly, if briefly, he'd come back because after Farida died, the city felt too full of a life he no longer had. It was the first time he'd said his late wife's name out loud to someone outside his family in 2 years. He noticed himself saying it, and felt, for a moment, unsteady. Miriam noticed too. She didn't push. She simply said, "Grief moves through a family like weather, doesn't it? It doesn't hit one person. It changes the whole climate." She said it lightly, almost as an aside, already moving on to ask him something about his son. She had no idea what the sentence did to the man sitting across from her. Haroon went very still. For 2 years, everyone around him had spoken about Farida's death in careful, padded language. "She's in a better place. Time heals. You must be strong for the children." Nobody had described it the way it actually felt, which was exactly what Miriam had just said, without even realizing its weight. Not one wound, but a whole changed climate, a different air in every room of the house, a different weather system that had moved in and never quite moved out. He didn't say any of this out loud. He simply sat there, sitting forward in his chair, and realized, with some surprise, that he could not remember the last time he had sat forward for anyone. Miriam, noticing his silence, tilted her head. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," Haroon said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "You said something right." They met 3 more times over the following month, each meeting a little longer than the last, each conversation drifting further from careful and formal into something that felt, to both of them, closer to friendship than courtship, though neither would have used either word out loud. Miriam told her mother, after the second meeting, that she still wasn't sure about marrying him, but that she no longer disliked the idea of talking to him, which was, for Miriam, practically a declaration of love by most standards. "He's not what I expected," she admitted one evening, sitting on the kitchen counter while her mother cooked. "That first day, in the sitting room, I thought he was looking at me like furniture. Now I think maybe he just didn't know how to look at anyone properly. Like he'd forgotten how. And now? Now I think he's remembering." Her mother, stirring a pot of something that smelled like childhood, didn't say anything triumphant or say "I told you so," which Miriam appreciated. She simply nodded and let her daughter keep talking, the way good mothers know when to be quiet. For Haroon, the change was less something he noticed happening and more something his sister pointed out to him, the way outsiders often see a person's transformation before the person sees it themselves. "You've started humming," she told him one morning, over the newspaper. "I haven't." "You have. In the kitchen, this morning. I nearly dropped the tea." He hadn't noticed. He thought about it and realized she was probably right. He had been humming, some tune he couldn't place, something that might have belonged to Farida once, or might have belonged to no one at all, just a sound his body had decided to make, because for the first time in 2 years, it had something to hum about. It was around this time that Miriam did the thing that changed everything. They had been sitting at the same cafe, the 4th meeting, and she had asked him, carefully, without any of her usual bluntness, as though she'd been building up to it for weeks, what his first wife had actually been like. Not the polite version people give at funerals, not a resume of good qualities, the real version. What was she actually like, Miriam asked. Not what everyone says about her now that she's gone. What was she like when she was just living, annoying you, making you laugh? Haroon opened his mouth to answer, and found, to his own surprise, that nothing came out. He closed it again. In 2 years, no one had asked him this question. Everyone had talked around Farida the way people walk carefully around furniture in a dark room, avoiding the shape of her, out of politeness, out of fear of causing him pain, until eventually the furniture became a kind of ghost nobody would look at directly. Miriam had just looked directly at it. He took a breath, and then, slowly, imperfectly, getting the words wrong and starting over more than once, He began to talk about his wife. He said she was stubborn, more stubborn than anyone he'd ever met, including himself, which was saying something. He said she hated the cold and complained about it every single winter for 26 years, as though the cold were a personal insult aimed specifically at her. He said she used to laugh at her own jokes before she even finished telling them, so that by the time she reached the punchline she was laughing too hard to say it properly, and he'd have to guess the ending, and half the time he guessed wrong, and that made her laugh even harder. He said she knew, somewhere in all those 26 years, that he wasn't a man who said things out loud, that he loved in silence, in actions, in paid bills and fixed roofs and quiet presence, not in words. And he said she had loved him anyway, had never once demanded the words he couldn't give her, and he had spent 2 years since her death wondering what a person was supposed to do with a love like that. A love that had been enough for her, but that he sometimes worried had never been enough, full stop, because he'd never said it. Never once in 26 years said the words "I love you" out loud, and now there was no one left to say them to. He stopped talking. His hands, he noticed, were slightly unsteady around his teacup. Miriam didn't fill the silence. She didn't rush to comfort him, didn't say the practiced things people say. She's at peace now. She knew you loved her. Time heals. She simply sat there, letting the silence hold whatever it needed to hold, letting him have the space that 2 years of well-meaning people had never given him. Finally, she said, quietly, "You just said it out loud, just now, to me." Harun looked up. "Maybe that's not nothing," Miriam said. He proposed properly 2 weeks later, and this time he did not go through Rukhsana Baji, and he did not go to Mariam's father first. He went to Mariam directly, on a Sunday afternoon that felt, in its own quiet way, like it was correcting the Sunday that had started all of this. He didn't have a speech prepared. He wasn't a man of speeches. He simply said, "I don't want a wife the way I wanted one 3 months ago. I wanted someone reasonable, someone who wouldn't embarrass me at dinner. I've stopped wanting that. Now I want someone who tells me the truth, even when I haven't asked for it. Who forgets appointments and argues about rice and asks questions nobody else has the courage to ask. I want you, not because you fit some list, because you're the only person who's made me feel like a person again, instead of a man just filling his days until they run out." Miriam, who had teased and joked her way through every difficult conversation of her adult life, found that for once she had nothing clever to say. She said yes. The wedding, when it came, was not extravagant. Ghulam Yusuf gave a short, dry speech that made half the room laugh and the other half cry, which he considered a perfectly balanced result. Nasreen cried through most of the ceremony, partly from happiness and partly from the exhaustion of having survived the entire process. Rania attended with the man from her office, having finally, in the month since Miriam's engagement, found the courage to tell her parents the truth, a courage she credited, quietly, to watching her youngest sister say no to a marriage everyone expected her to accept. Dina came too, and if there was still a small private ache somewhere in her chest, she didn't let it show, and by the end of the evening, watching her sister dance badly and laugh loudly at her own poorly executed dance moves, the ache had softened into something closer to genuine happiness for her. Harun's sister cried the most of anyone, though she would deny this for years afterward. Married life, when it began, was not a fairy tale, because real lives rarely are. Harun remained a man who preferred order to spontaneity, who sometimes retreated into silence when he should have spoken, who still, after everything, struggled to say certain words out loud. Miriam remained a woman who forgot appointments, argued about rice, and refused to be managed or organized into someone easier to live with. There were months that were hard in small, undramatic ways. Arguments about nothing, misunderstandings that took days to untangle, the ordinary friction of 2 very different people learning to share a life. But something had changed in him, and it kept changing, slowly, the way seasons change, not all at once, but so that one day you look up and realize the trees are different than they were before. He started noticing where people's eyes went when they spoke. He started sitting forward, not just for Miriam, but for his son, for his sister, For strangers who told him stories at dinner parties he would once have found unbearably long. He learned, slowly, imperfectly, to say things out loud. Not everything, not always, but more than he ever had before. One evening, a few months into the marriage, he came home to find that Miriam had placed a photograph of Farida on his desk. An old one, from years before he even knew her, one of the few photos he had that showed her laughing mid-sentence, exactly the way he'd described her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at it. "Why did you put this here?" he asked, when Miriam came to find him. "Because she made you soft enough to find me," Miriam said simply. It felt wrong to pretend she wasn't part of the reason you knew how to love someone at all. He didn't answer. He didn't have the words for it. Not yet, maybe not ever entirely. But he sat down at his desk, and he sat forward, and for a long time he simply looked at the photograph of a woman who had loved him in silence for 26 years, and beside him stood a woman who had refused to accept anything less than being truly seen. And somewhere in that quiet room, between one wife's memory and another wife's presence, Harun Malik finally understood the difference between choosing a wife and finding one, and understood that he had spent 51 years doing the first, and only truly done the second, the day a young woman walked into his life with flour on her sleeve and an argument about rice still on her lips, utterly unprepared to be chosen, and completely unwilling to be anything other than herself. He had not cared, once, which daughter he married. Then he met the last one, and he never wanted anyone else again,